Hey, if you work in real estate long enough, you eventually learn something very important. The deals that fall apart rarely collapse because of the buyer's desire or intent to purchase. They most often collapse because of the inspection and the outcome of a very critical negotiation. And on top of that, sometimes even the paperwork changes. Recently, the Northwest Multiple Listing Service released updates to Form 35, the inspection addendum. Now on the surface, it still looks like the same form agents have been using for years, but buried inside the revisions are some subtle changes that can have some, very real consequences in a transaction. And if you haven't taken a close look at the new language, you might miss them. One of the areas we're giving attention here right now is the sewer inspection section. The updated language now distinguishes between sewer systems and on-site sewage systems, or what we call septic systems. That difference might sound small, but in practice, it can change what is and isn't actually being inspected during the contingency period, which means buyers, sellers, and even experienced agents could walk into an inspection assuming something is covered when legally it may not be. So today we're going to break down Form 35, the inspection contingency, because this form is one of the most important negotiation tools in a residential real estate transaction. It determines how inspections happen, how repair requests work, how negotiations unfold, and sometimes whether the deal survives at all. So today, we're doing a deep dive on the deal. Joining me today is someone uniquely qualified to help us walk through it. Someone we all know and love very well. I've introduced him before. Now I'm going to introduce him again. Sir David T. Bastian. Good to see you, man. Thank you.
Just keep it simple.
Thank you for driving all the way out here to join us again today on this podcast.
Happy to do it, James.
I love it. Dave, as you know, is both a designated broker and a longtime real estate attorney, which means he sees these forms from two different perspectives. Most people don't have at the same time: the legal framework and the real world reality of transactions. Dave, thanks again for joining me.
Happy to be here.
Let's start with what's probably the most hidden revision in the latest version of the Form 35, the sewer inspection clause. The updated language explains that the buyer's inspection may include a sewer system inspection, including a sewer line video inspection, but it also clarifies that if the property is served by an on-site sewage system, meaning a septic system, the inspection may be limited to the line connecting the house to that system. So Dave, let's start right there. What changed in the new language?
Well, the language in the previous iteration of Form 35 essentially referred to a sewer system and whether or not the buyer could have a sewer line video done of the sewer line. I would say some of us in the industry interpreted that as talking about a sewer system that included an on-site sewer system or an on-site septic system, and thought the language was broad enough to include a septic system as well as a sewer line that might be connected to the city sewer main, something like that. Well, recently, as of February this year, for some reason, the Northwest MLS, that's the entity that creates these forms. Let me be clear though, that when a seller and a buyer enter into a contract, this is their contract and it's between them. And it's not what the Northwest MLS intended, but it's what the buyer and the seller intended by their contract. But for some reason, the Northwest MLS, in revising this, kind of doubled down on the fact that their interpretation is that a sewer line is just a line that's going to the city main, and it is not including a septic system. And so they limited the language here to say that if we're talking about an on-site sewage system, meaning a septic system, the only thing the buyer has the right to scope is from the house, the main line, to the septic tank. And they don't have a right to inspect anything further than that.
Not even to the D box of the septic system.
And ironically, the line from the house to the tank is the thing that goes wrong the least amount of time, and it's from the tank beyond where we find most of our problems, and a great deal of the problems are found in the drain field, which now, based on their interpretation of this language and the way they've changed it, is they've kind of eliminated the buyer's ability to be able to inspect that line. Now, I personally happen to disagree with the Northwest MLS's interpretation of their own form.
Okay, explain.
And the reason why is if we go right to the very first line of this septic inspection contingency, or actually it's the whole home and property inspection contingency. And the first line says, this agreement, meaning the purchase and sale agreement, is conditioned on buyer's subjective satisfaction with inspections, that's plural, of the property and the improvements on the property. And I don't think that anybody can argue that a septic system is not an improvement on the property. And so, in my opinion, that first line, which is very inclusive of the home and everything else that's on the property, includes a septic system, and a buyer has the right to inspect that entire system. But for some reason, it seems that the Northwest MLS's interpretation is different than that, and it doesn't include an inspection of the septic system or a scoping of those lines. And that's one of the reasons why they have limited this language, and in their forms manual where they opine on it, they reiterate their interpretation that it doesn't include an inspection of the septic system. And then they point to additional language, which is paragraph 9 in this addendum, which is called an on-site sewage disposal system advisory. This says, buyer is advised that OSS systems are subject to strict governmental regulation and occasional malfunction and even failure. Okay, that's important to have in there. We want our buyers to understand that an inspection of the system is critical when you're purchasing a piece of property. Then it goes on to say, buyer is advised to consider conducting an inspection of any OSS system in addition to the inspection of the property provided by this Form 35 by including an appropriate OSS system inspection contingency such as the Northwest MLS Form 22S. Okay, all of that sounds really good. You know, they're saying that, hey, buyer, you should consider doing your own inspection of this on-site sewage system. And they suggest that you could use their form, which is 22S, which is the septic contingency. Right. The problem with this is that the Form 22S is not a buyer's inspection of the septic system. It's a seller's inspection of the septic system, and a report that is created by a seller paid for inspection by a septic company that will come out, they will pump the septic system, they will then inspect it for the health of the system and whether or not there's any water intrusion. They really don't get much further than the tank unless there's something that leads them to believe they need to inspect further. And so a lot of times these inspections are superficial. They fill out a report and they submit it to the Kitsap County or Pierce County, which are the two counties that we deal with the most out here. And then the health officer of that county does their own inspection of the paperwork, maybe an on-site inspection, but not necessarily. And then they create their own report. The problem here is, though, that in none of these, so we have the Form 22S, which is the septic contingency. Then we have a county-specific form for Kitsap County, and we have another county-specific form for Pierce County. And in none of those forms does the buyer have the ability to do their own inspection of the septic system. buyers are left to rely on the seller, a seller paid inspection, and maybe it catches things, maybe it doesn't catch things. We've had situations before in Kitsap County where the seller performs the inspection. The inspector makes the application to the health officer in Kitsap County. Kitsap County reviews it, the health department, and their opinion is that as of right now, there are no items of non-compliance.
And it seems to be in perfectly working order.
And it seems to be working fine, but they might note something which is not a major item of compliance. It's something like, hey, you might want to note in the future that something may fail within 2 or 3 years. But right now, it's just fine. Well, when we're talking about repairs of septic systems, price tags on those are often starting at $30,000 and going up from there. That's a serious item that needs to be inspected by a buyer, and the buyer needs to decide whether or not they want to purchase, or whether or not they want to negotiate a repair, or if they want to negotiate a reduction in the purchase price. It is a significant item of negotiation, yet for some reason our forms don't allow the buyer to do that.
And this is a tough one here. How do agents need to modify their strategy when protecting their clients' best interests?
Well, it's very difficult in a market that's a seller's market. And we are still in a seller's market. That's primarily because we're low on inventory. And because we're low on inventory, that just puts power into the seller's hands. And so
there's more competition right now.
Right. And so buyers come into a transaction feeling like I may be up against a multiple offer situation. How do I craft my offer in a way that the seller's going to feel comfortable selecting our offer as the best offer? And so what tends to happen frequently is the buyers are deciding, you know what, I'm not going to push the issue on this septic inspection. And I'm just going to count on the county spotting an issue and calling it out. But buyers have been left holding the bag sometimes when the county comes back and says, well, there's nothing major wrong right now, but you might have a drain field failure in 2 or 3 years. And in Kitsap County, there's no way for the buyer to terminate that deal. In Pierce County, there is a provision that allows them to terminate the transaction if they're not happy with the report that comes back from the county. But in Kitsap County, there's no such provision in the septic addendum. And so you just have to kind of take what the county gives you, which may be good advice, maybe not, maybe they missed something. But what I don't like is in an atmosphere of consumer protection. When we're trying to protect buyers, when we're in a seller's market, when the sellers really have a strong negotiating position, buyers are left with no opportunity to inspect one of the most critical systems of this home.
Back in the day, we didn't have cameras to scope systems, and now we do, and you're seeing in deals more often than not, people running their sewer inspections. But I see brokers, running cameras through not the broker itself, but the professional scoping a drain field. Sometimes, we've heard in our office recently, root intrusion, biomat in some of these drain fields. You might not see. What if it's at the very end, the last few feet? So.
I was just looking at one last week, and the camera's going down the line, and you can see the line is perfectly clear, but you can see where the pipe is cracked, and you can see the dirt, and it is just a matter of time. There's roots are going to come in, that thing's going to clog, and you're going to have at least a failed line. It'll be a big problem. It'll be an expensive fix.
Yeah, it is. Can't tell you how many deals over the years where we've had either drain field repairs or drain field replacements, And some things that were gravity back in the day are no longer. And as you know, a alternative type of system typically runs $30,000 to $50,000. Remember when gravity systems were $5,000?
Yeah.
I installed turned a 2-bedroom system to a 3-bedroom system like back in 2003 for like $1,000.
Well, I never got away with $1,000, but we did one. We turned a 2-bedroom system into a 3-bedroom by adding a leg to the drain field. The tank was big enough, and it cost $5,000 to do it. And by being able to turn that home from a 2-bedroom home into a 3-bedroom home, it netted the seller at least $100,000. And so that $5,000 was
well, it's a very good spend.
Yeah.
Even though sometimes you appraisers only give a $5,000 adjustment from your Marshall Swift handbook, we think we get a lot more for a 2-bedroom or 3-bedroom house, also depending on the location. So why is this distinction between sewer systems and septic systems so important for agents to understand?
Well, they need to be aware that as far as the Northwest MLS is concerned, this inspection contingency does not include an inspection of the septic system. I disagree with that. The language says inspections of the property and improvements of the property. I think it does. But the problem is that when you've got an entity like the Northwest MLS waiting in on an interpretation, because there are enough brokers in the industry that are going to follow that advice, they kind of set the standard of the industry. And so then it comes down to, Bastian here saying, well, I think the contract's actually written differently. We then have the tide of enough brokers interpreting it differently and explaining it to their clients differently, that's going to be an uphill battle, even though I think the language is clear and unambiguous. And so I am not going to advise my clients to rely on that language, even though I think that's what it says. So in the absence of having a document created by the Northwest MLS that allows the buyer to inspect the septic system, we've created our own addendum, and I know a couple of other firms out there have done the same thing, where we want to encourage our buyers to have a full inspection of all of these critical systems. And then it's up to our buyers to decide within the negotiations on this transaction how strongly they want to push that. But I want our clients to know that it's available to them and that we recommend it. And I tell our clients, look, this is really the only opportunity that you're going to have to determine the health of your septic system prior to owning it and having to write the check for any repairs. And so this is the time to do it. And if I were representing a seller and a buyer wanted to do an inspection of the septic system or anything else on the home, it's let them do it. This is the time for sellers to remove liability by allowing an inspection. If a seller takes a position of I don't want the buyer to do an inspection, then they're putting themselves in a position that if something goes wrong, that they may have to pay for that because they did not put the buyer in the position of doing their due diligence by eliminating that. So I think that sellers always should be allowing inspections. From a lawyer standpoint, that's the way you get down the road after the transaction and you don't hear from the buyer again. Typically, if a seller is hearing from a buyer, it's not good news. They're rarely calling up to say, let's go out and get a dessert together. It's because something has gone wrong and they're looking at the seller and saying, you knew about this, why didn't you tell me about it? We want our sellers to allow buyers to do full inspections. That's the way that they protect themselves from liability in the future. And so I always encourage sellers to allow that. But I am a little baffled, and I would request that the Northwest MLS reconsider their position I don't know, we have a form right now that says you can do inspections. Well, why not reinterpret it and say that includes an inspection of the septic system? That'd be very simple to do that. If for some reason they're uncomfortable with that, okay, well, let's develop an inspection contingency of the septic system that allows the buyer to do a buyer-paid inspection of the septic system instead of relying on a seller-paid inspection of the septic system. It just makes sense, especially in this day and age of liability and representations. There's no reason why we shouldn't have that. In our office, we have created one for the buyer to use if the buyer wants to do their own inspection. And we've tied it into an inspection contingency that is separate from this home inspection contingency, and we've got another version of it that ties it right into this. And so all the time frames for asking for repairs and the seller's response are built into it. And we'll continue to use that until the Northwest MLS.
That's another revision. Hey, another key piece of Form 35 is the inspection period itself. The form states that if the parties don't specify a different number of days, the inspection contingency by default lasts 10 days after mutual acceptance, but more often that time frame is shortened in negotiations. So basically that clock starts immediately once the agreement is mutual, and during that window the buyer has time to make some decisions. They can approve the inspection, they can terminate the inspection, they can request additional inspections, or they can propose repairs or modifications to the contract. Dave, from your perspective, where do agents most often run into trouble when it comes to managing the inspection timeline?
Well, I would say in terms of contracts going wrong, the timing of when the inspection request is made throughout the negotiation process, there's more mistakes made there in counting the days that the contract allows for. There are more problems in counting those days than anywhere else in the contract. And so when we have problems, a high percentage of the problems come to that process in the contract. So if we just stick with the defaults that are in the contract, we have a inspection period of 10 days. Often that's negotiated to less, as you mentioned. And then once the buyer has submitted to the seller requests for repairs or requests for additional inspection, typically the seller has 3 days to respond. And in these contracts, we have a provision in it called computation of time, which can get kind of complicated. So anything that's 6 days or more, we count calendar days, and it just can't end on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. And so if I delivered something to you, like a 35R requesting repairs to something on the house, the day I deliver it to you is day 0, and the next day is day 1. And then we're just going to count until we get to the number of days, in this case day 10, and then we're going to look and see if it ends on a Saturday, Sunday, or a legal holiday. And if it does, then it's the next day that is not a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. And that's the general rule. For anything 6 days or more, that's the rule. But if it's 5 days or less, then essentially all we're counting are business days, which means your day 1 can't be a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. You don't count those days in the middle of a contract, and you can't end on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. So your timing can get confusing.
So if delivery's Friday, Wednesday's your time to respond.
Right. So if I delivered this on Friday, then my day 1 is Monday, day 2 is Tuesday, day 3 would be on Wednesday, and we happen to have 9 o'clock as the deadline that's specified in our contract. But then where it gets tricky is that the buyer's reply to the seller's response also has a 3-day, but it begins when the seller actually responds or when the seller should have responded. And that's where people get messed up sometimes. So let's say I delivered to you my request for repairs on Friday and you responded on Friday. Well, now that triggers my new response time. You didn't take until Wednesday, you responded today. And so now I've got 3 days to respond, which is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday at 9 o'clock.
Yep.
The same time that you had the ability to respond by under the contract. And so that throws people off sometimes. They think, well, you responded today, but you didn't have to until Wednesday. And so Thursday's my day one. Well, by that time, under the contract, you would have waived your inspection contingency by not responding on time. So you just have to be really careful in this process of, you need to understand what triggers your counting of days. And let's say that I delivered this to you on Friday, you had until Wednesday at 9 o'clock, and you didn't respond at all. Well, under those circumstances, no response is still a response.
Right. And you're referring to the seller's response, which is part two.
Right.
Yeah.
So I, as a buyer, made a request for repairs.
Yep.
And I did it on a Friday. You had until Wednesday to get back to me with your reply, and you ignored it. Well, that ignoring of my request is the same as an answer, and essentially it's you've said no, and then that means that the buyer's response time or reply begins on Thursday, is their day one. So you have Thursday, Friday, and Monday at 9 is when you'd have to respond by.
And that's even if I responded late, for instance, on Thursday.
If you then, so here's a typical scenario. You are looking in good faith at the, the roof that I wanted you to fix, or the electrical panel, or, something significant, plumbing repairs, something like that. And what you are doing in good faith is looking at contractor bids to determine how much is this going to cost me to comply to the buyer's request. And so you're looking at that, and you just don't have your answers by Wednesday. Well, I think a good listing broker is going to communicate with the buyer broker and say, hey, we're looking at this. We're probably going to get back to you on Thursday or Friday. But a good buyer broker is going to say, great, love that you're going to get back to me, but I still have to start counting as if you had responded on Wednesday night.
But we could choose, if we needed the extra time and they needed more time to discuss, we could choose to extend that period.
And that would be a best practice.
Sure.
So absolutely, if the parties are negotiating in good faith, and sometimes in order to act in good faith, you need a little more time to get some real numbers to know what we're talking about here. The seller to commit to something like, yeah, I'll repair all that, and not know what that's going to cost is not a brilliant idea. So it'd be really easy to communicate with the other side and say, we're working on this, we want to comply, but we need more time. And then the parties just enter into an extension of that time.
In some cases I've seen, you have some brokers very experienced and they've done this a long time, and they get it. And I've seen some agents make this mistake in that reply period where there can be a negotiation. You don't just have the opportunity to reject the seller's response. You can reject it, terminate the deal. You could accept it, move to closing, but you can also repropose. Right. And I've seen some brokers, maybe just inexperienced, or maybe they just weren't taught, counter back, thinking now they've got another 3 days, and then their reply to that counter is another 3 days, and they don't understand that there's a hard deadline. And when they miss that,
yeah, it's a problem.
Malpractice.
And I think where a lot of the confusion comes is we spend a lot of time, and our brokers, when they're getting their license, they study contract law. And part of that is the law of offer and acceptance. So if I am making an offer to you, that offer is open until I have an expiration. If I have an expiration date, it's open until the date I gave you. And if I don't, that offer is open to you for a reasonable period of time, or until I withdraw my offer. And if you make a new offer to me, we call that a counter offer. That means my offer is off the table. You've just countered me. Well, this process of going back and forth with offer and acceptance seems a lot like what's going on with this negotiation under the inspection contingency, in that the buyer asks the seller for repairs. The seller has an opportunity to respond to that. The buyer has an opportunity to respond back to the seller. But the difference is that it's not exactly like an offer and acceptance situation at the beginning of the contract, because in the inspection contingency, we've mapped out what this dance is going to look like. And essentially that is, buyer has X number of days, 10 is the default to request repairs. The seller then has 3 days to respond, and then the buyer has 3 days to respond to that. That feels like offer and acceptance and negotiation, but it isn't. It's spelled out. And so once I give you my request for repairs, you have 3 days, and I can't then say, oh, you know what? I changed my mind. I want to make a different request. Because once I give it to you, we've now just triggered the contract and the timing that we've set forth there, which is you've got 3 days to respond.
We got to come to an agreement before that deadline, or it's over.
Right.
Or waived.
And that's one of the most important things here that at least buyer brokers very much need to be aware of, is that when we're in that last 3 days, you can go back and forth 100 times. That does not change your deadline to get something done. And your options are that by the end of that time frame, no matter what's going on and how many times you've gone back and forth, and everybody might be negotiating in good faith, but that final deadline is not extended unless you do an addendum to the contract extending it. The fact that you've got an offer out and you're waiting to hear back does not extend your time to have this deal done. And your options at that point are that you can either say that the inspection is satisfied, or you can terminate the deal, or you come to some agreement. And if that doesn't happen by that final deadline, and you haven't come to some agreement or satisfied it or terminated the deal,
or extended it,
or
further negotiations needed, maybe you're close, but there's a little more research, but that's getting complicated.
Something needs to happen by that date, or the consequence is, it's not that the transaction's terminated, it's that the buyer has waived their financing contingency and the parties are moving on to closing without the seller being required to make any repairs whatsoever.
And that's a problem if you're expecting a serious repair made.
Yeah. So, that's having to explain to your buyer how that deadline came and went, and oops, no, you're not going to get your roof repaired that you thought.
Right.
And the repair for which you don't want to buy this house unless it's made, and so that's a problem that's tough to fix.
So another provision that deserves some attention is the section allowing buyers to obtain additional inspections if the original inspector recommends further evaluation. For example, a home inspector might recommend bringing in a structural engineer or a sewer specialist or a roofer or an electrician. The buyer must give notice of the intent to obtain additional inspections before the inspection period expires in order to receive more time. So Dave, how important is it for agents to understand when we give notice of additional inspection? Obviously, we can't just send the inspection report anymore. You send the inspection report without written permission by the seller, it's a big problem. Let's talk about that. Or let's get into how, if the seller requests to see just the items that they're making requests on, repair requests on, redacting out the appropriate parts of the inspection report so they doesn't cost them waiving the inspection. It's a little complicated there.
It does get complicated. And to understand what's going on, it might be best to go back and look at some of the history of what's going on with this contract. Prior to the language that was put in the contract a number of years ago, which essentially requires that a buyer or buyer broker not deliver the inspection report or any portion of it to a seller. That was added in a few years ago, and the reason why is because what was happening in the industry is that buyer does an inspection of the property. seller is in a position where they may not know some of the things that are in that inspection. And if the seller does know about it, then they have a duty to disclose it to any future buyers. And so the buyers were using that as leverage in a negotiation to say to a seller, hey, look, we want this roof put on, or we want this septic repaired, or we want this electrical panel fixed. And by the way, when we give you the notice that we want these things fixed, we also submit with it the entire inspection report, which now may trigger a duty for a future transaction that this seller has to disclose everything that was in our inspection report. Well, that gave a lot of negotiating strength, a lot of leverage to the buyer in that negotiation. And the comment would be to that seller, look, we just rung the bell. You're going to have to disclose this to every future buyer, and every future buyer is going to ask you to get it fixed. And so instead of going on to a future buyer, why don't you just stick with us and make the repairs that we're asking for? And so folks thought that that was too much leverage for a buyer to have in a negotiation. And so the idea was then to eliminate the ability of a buyer or a buyer broker to submit that inspection report to the seller unless the seller requests it in writing. So,
yeah, I remember, because literally all the good old days, I would write C, inspection report, commentary items, 1B, 3C.
And we would submit the entire report, which would then trigger the necessity, in many cases, of a seller to have to revise their seller disclosure statement. If they move on to another buyer, they'd have to revise that document, because now the bell's been rung on these other things that the seller didn't know about before and really didn't have a duty to disclose.
It gets a little tricky too, actually, because often, for instance, we can't use an inspection unless given permission, and then there's the part about what about, I think the most effective way to ask for repair is actually having a contractor come out, get a bid, and then you're referring to the job scope inside of that bid or the specific bid itself. It's cleaner, and you've got the recommendation for the repair straight from a specialist. Right. And how do the lines get blurred, in your opinion, where a actual contractor's estimate is considered an inspection of itself?
Well, those lines were very blurred up until last month, and we were having to deal with that. And of course, when you represent a buyer, the consequence for delivering any portion of the inspection to the seller was to waive your inspection contingency. That is a very big consequence.
It is.
And so if you represent a buyer, you would be very conservative regarding that. And so then what's the difference between an inspector's report and a bid for repairs? Because that came from an inspection of the property, and so what's the difference really between those two documents? And it's, in my mind, there's a distinction, because a home inspector is a different kind of entity than a contractor coming in and giving a bid. But do I want to be the test case on that and be the one arguing to a judge somewhere down the line as to whether or not we actually waived our inspection contingency because this thing is different from that thing? I'm not going to do that. And so my advice to my client is going to be, let's be conservative, and we're not going to submit that bid unless the seller asks for it in writing and we have it. In many cases, the sellers would do that because they want to see what it is that we have found, or they want to see what is it that you're actually proposing that I fix on the property. I want to see what the seller or the inspector actually said. So recently, though, in February, the Northwest MLS revised the inspection contingency to specify that when we're asking for repairs, that an attached bid for those repairs does not constitute delivering the inspection report or any portion of the report. So they made the distinction that I was making, but now it's built into and baked right into the contract.
That's a change I can stand by.
Yeah, that's a
like that.
great change.
100% agree.
Yeah, if they just fix the septic stuff, I'd be really happy with it.
Please. If you're watching MLS. All right, so when you step back and look at the inspection contingency as a whole, it really is one of the most important moments in an entire transaction. It's when the buyer learns the true condition of the property, it's when negotiations often intensify, and it's when deals sometimes fall apart, unfortunately. Dave, if you were advising agents navigating Form 35, what are the biggest things they should keep in mind to avoid surprises?
Well, first of all, as an agent, you need to be aware of and confidently be able to count the time frames that are set forth in this addendum. And so you've got to be confident in doing that. And if you're not confident, just hook up with somebody who's been doing it a long time and can coach you through that. That's really important to protect your buyer as well as the firm. The second thing is that this is a new negotiation point in the contract, and it's like everything's on the table now. You don't have to ask for repairs. You can ask for a price reduction.
Absolutely, or a closing cost credit.
Closing cost credit. You can. It's kind of anything you want to do. It's a time that you can be very creative. Yeah. And sometimes the buyers might come in with several requests, and the seller might say, I don't want to make any of those requests. I'll give you money instead. There's pros and cons to both of those things. The buyer, if the buyer's going to make repairs themselves afterward, they can hire their own contractor and supervise it themselves. The downside to that is that a buyer might discover after it's closed that the issue's even deeper than they thought. Whereas if the seller was making the repairs and they took the siding off and found out that the framing's all rotten inside, that would be up to the seller to repair. So there's pros and cons to both sides of this, and you have to think about it and negotiate it. But getting your timing down, getting the negotiations correct, relying on your client to instruct you on how they want it done. This is not the broker's negotiation. It's the seller's negotiation and the buyer's negotiation, and we facilitate that.
What if the buyer in some case may not be as educated to home repairs or what's like serious in a report? Some people are fearful of some electrical items, for instance. There's safety concerns, but they might not necessarily cost a whole lot. Some do, many don't, versus, let's say, rodent intrusion in a crawl space. That costs a lot of money, but a lot of times people aren't even worried about that. How do you feel it's on the agent to also advise their buyer clients what some of the things they should ask for?
Well, first off, we're not home inspectors.
Right.
That's not our job, and it's really important that we as brokers stay in our lane. And our lane is to be well aware of what our licensing duties are, what our agent duties to our client are. We should know our contracts inside and out. We should know how to negotiate. We should know how to market properties. That's what our lane is. Our lane is not being a home inspector. Even if you've been down in that crawl space 100 times in past transactions, you should not put on the cap of a home inspector. And so what we need to be good at doing is referring our clients to the appropriate person to answer their question. We should be a conduit for them to get them to the actual expert. And I'm not an expert at rodent intrusion, even though I've dealt with it personally and dealt with it in other transactions. So my job is to get my buyer to the people who know that job and get them conversing with them. Same thing like if there's something on a title report. We're not title officers, and so we get our clients to the title officers.
Be a great referrer.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, the inspection contingency isn't just about the house. It's about how the parties respond to new information. The inspection report introduces facts. Form 35 determines how those facts affect the deal. And understanding how this form works allows agents and buyers to make informed decisions instead of emotional ones. Every real estate transaction has a moment where the excitement of the accepted offer meets the reality of the property. And for many deals, that moment is the inspection. So Form 35 is the roadmap that determines what happens next. Today we looked at the revised sewer inspection clause, the difference between sewer systems and septic systems, the inspection timeline, as well as additional inspections in that process. The negotiation process that can ultimately determine whether a deal closes. Dave, thank you again for helping us take a deep dive on this form. It's always awesome to have you on and hear your insight, brother. If you found this episode helpful, subscribe to my Living in Kitsap County channel so you don't miss future episodes where we unpack the real world situations hiding inside real estate contracts. And if you know someone buying, selling, or working in real estate, share this episode with them, because in real estate, the difference between a smooth closing and a collapsed deal often comes down to understanding the fine print.